Hello and welcome. I am Christopher Jon Bjerknes. It is July 5th, 2022, and today I am going to be discussing a taboo topic, as I so often do. In 1797, the German poet, Freemason, and Illuminati member Goethe stated that Moses had been murdered by Joshua and Caleb because Moses was inept, a bungler, and was constantly leading the Israelites to their doom. But was it actually Joshua and Caleb who murdered Moses? Two other prominent scholars who took up this theme were Ernst Sellin and Sigmund Freud. Freud made this fairly common knowledge in his book Moses and Monotheism, and theologians and religious people have been trying to deny what Freud brought out ever since. So first, let's point out that in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there have been numerous accusations that the Israelites murdered their prophets, and Moses was one of the greatest among those prophets. And I'm not saying that the common understanding in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is that Moses was murdered. Quite the contrary. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 5 says that he simply died. But there are a number of facts which indicate that the Israelites felt a burden of sin for murdering Moses. And in fact, they seek to be redeemed for that sin by the coming of a Messiah. And it was the sin of murdering Moses and not the sin of casting the golden calf under Aaron, which has so plagued the Israelites. The reason why the Israelites murdered their prophets is because they always hated Yahweh. Yahweh was a terrible God who was constantly cursing them to complete extermination. And his prophets were often tyrants who imposed irrational and devastating laws on the Israelites, which they resented and which often brought them into disaster and calamity. They did not want the prophets. They did not want Yahweh to be their God. The Old Testament is replete with numerous verses which state that the Israelites rejected Yahweh, rejected his law, and sought foreign gods in the form of Baal, Asherah, the queen of heaven, etc. And they were very eager to remove the cacodemon Yahweh from their lives. So it makes a lot of sense that they would have killed their prophets and the lawbringer Moses, because he brought this God, Yahweh, into their lives. And Yahweh is a cacodemon, and the Israelites only pretended to love and worship Yahweh so that he would refrain from exterminating them, as he so often threatened to do, and instead would help them to battle against the enemies of Israel. Here is a listing of some of the passages which reveal the fact that in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, and in the Quran, it frequently states that the Israelites killed their prophets. For example, Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 26 states, "But they were disobedient and rebelled against you. They turned their backs on your law. They killed your prophets who had warned them in order to turn them back to you. They committed awful blasphemies." 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 10 and 14 states, "He replied, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. Paul quoted that passage frequently. He replied, "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." This is the passage in a book that was published of Goethe's collected writings called Westöstlicher Divan von Goethe, Stuttgart in der Gatteiischen Buchhandlung 1819. But this was written in 1797. I believe the title of the article that this is contained in is Israel in der Wüste, Israel in the Desert. And in this article, Goethe, who was an extremely learned man and a real Renaissance man, delved in many fields, including even optics, was a very knowledgeable Freemason, was an Illuminist in the Illuminati, and had a great deal of esoteric and occult knowledge, said that Joshua and Caleb, the two of the 12 spies that were sent into Canaan to scope it out and see if it was fit for habitation by the Israelites. And Joshua and Caleb were the only two spies who said that, yes, the Israelites should invade Canaan and take it over, and they would be successful. The other 10 spies were fearful and inspired fear in the Israelites and kept them from invading. So God sided with Joshua, who was of the tribe of Ephraim, and Caleb, who was of the tribe of Judah. He was a Judahite. And so those two were respected by God. But Moses offended God, and God himself threatened to kill Moses on different occasions. This is the author Ernst Sellin. He wrote Mose und seine Bedeutung für die israelitische-jüdische Religionsgeschichte, and that was published in 1922. Freud heavily cited that book, but Sellin wrote an even better book 2 years later, Geschichte des israelitisch-jüdischen Volkes, in 1924. And I've pulled up some excerpts of that for those of you who can read German. You can pause the video and read some of what Sellin had to say. He put a great deal of extensive research into this conception that Moses had been murdered and did not die a natural death. And Freud was really struck by that. And in his book, Moses and Monotheism, he wrote extensively about it, and I'm going to quote a few passages in which he refers to Ernst Sellin. In 1922, Ernst Sellin made a discovery of decisive importance. He found in the book of the prophet Hosea, second half of the 8th century, unmistakable traces of a tradition to the effect that the founder of their religion, Moses, met a violent end in a rebellion of his stubborn and refractory people. The religion he had instituted was at the same time abandoned. This tradition is not restricted to Hosea. It recurs in the writings of most of the later prophets. Indeed, according to Sellin, it was the basis of all the later expectations of the Messiah. Towards the end of the Babylonian exile, the hope arose among the Jewish people that the man they had so callously murdered would return from the realm of the dead and lead his contrite people, and perhaps not only his people, into the land of eternal bliss. The palpable connections with the destiny of the founder of a later religion do not lie in our present course. Now, this is implying that Moses returned as Jesus, and there are many, many parallels between the story of Moses and the story of Jesus, and Moses forms the typology and archetype of Jesus. And in this context, it's extremely interesting to note the fact that the Quran says that it frequently refers to Jesus as Asa, the son of Miriam. That Miriam is Moses' sister. And the Quran specifically states that Aaron is Jesus' uncle, and that his mother Miriam is the son of Imran, or Amram, who is Moses, Aaron, and Miriam's father. So the Quran very clearly states that Jesus is the son of Mary, that Mary is the sister of Moses and Aaron, and that Jesus lived in the time of Moses. And the scholar Ahmed Osman posits the notion that Moses was the Egyptian pharaoh who instituted the monotheism of the worship of the sun god Aten. The Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten is in fact Moses, and his son Tutankhamun represents Jesus. And I'm going to be discussing the Egyptian connections that the Quran points out to Judaism, to Moses, and to Jesus with Sami Abu Saleh in a couple of days. And please subscribe so that you can catch that interview. It promises to be extremely enlightening and interesting. Freud continued, "It was the murder of the great leader and liberator Moses, which Sellin divined from clues furnished by the prophets. Zellin's presumption cannot be called fanciful. It is probable enough. Moses, trained in Akhenaten's school, employed the same methods as the king. He gave commands and forced his religion on the people." Freud's theory is that Moses was a priest who was a disciple of Akhenaten, and that he led the followers of Akhenaten as a group when Akhenaten's religion and reign fell apart. And Moses went, and his father-in-law was Jethro, who was a Median priest. And Freud gets into those connections a lot. And I am looking into those connections with the Druze. The Druze view Akhenaten as a prophet like Moses, and their highest prophet is Jethro, the Median father-in-law of Moses. And the father-in-law of Moses becomes very significant because his sister Miriam resented the fact that her brother Moses had married a Cushite. And I suspect that Miriam and Aaron are also prime suspects in the murder of Moses. And that is one of my theories regarding who it was that murdered Moses in the mythologies of Judaism, and why it is that Judaism posits that the Israelites have to be redeemed for that sin of Moses, of murdering Moses. Freud continued, "The murder of Moses by his people, which Sellin recognized in the traces of tradition, and which, strangely enough, the young Goethe, citing Israel in der Wüste, Band 7 of the Weimar edition, page 170. I showed you the original first edition, not the later republication in the Weimar edition, which demonstrates the discrepancy in the pagination. Strangely enough, the young Goethe had assumed without any evidence, has thus become an indispensable part of our reasoning, an important link between the forgotten deed of primeval times and its subsequent reappearance in the form of monotheistic religions. It is an attractive suggestion that the guilt attached to the murder of Moses may have been the stimulus for the wish fantasy of the Messiah, who was to return and give to his people salvation and the promised sovereignty over the world. If Moses was this first Messiah, Christ became his substitute and successor. Then Paul could, with a certain right, say to the peoples, "See, the Messiah has truly come. He was indeed murdered before your eyes." And Freud posits the idea that this was a psychological phenomenon that after the centuries after the Israelites had murdered Moses because he was imposing this irrational law on them and had become a tyrant, they then felt guilty about that and totally flipped, and then sought a Messiah who would come and redeem them for this sin. But just as Moses was murdered, that Messiah too would have to be murdered as Jesus Christ was. Louis Ginsburg discussed some of the legends of the Jews, which lead me to theories that differ from Goethe, Sellin, and Freud as to who it was that this mythology states actually murdered Moses. I'm sure there are Kabbalists who are very learned men who know the full story of this. I think it relates to the Eglah Rufa and the broken neck calf and the story of Cain and Abel. And I think this is a retelling of the story of Cain and Abel in various forms. And we'll address that a little bit later. Let's first read what it is that Louis Ginsburg had to say. When the people saw Moses and Eleazar return without Aaron, they were not at all in the mood to lend faith to the communication of Aaron's death. They could not at all credit that a man who had overcome the angel of death was now overcome by him. 3 opinions were then formed among the people concerning Aaron's absence. Some declared that Moses had killed Aaron because he was jealous of his popularity. So perhaps the Israelites ganged up on Moses and murdered him because they believed that he had murdered Aaron just as Cain had murdered Abel. It is also possible that Abel played the role of Cain and murdered Moses. And there's another figure we're going to meet who is in the Judaist tradition considered to be the reincarnated soul of Cain, who may have murdered Moses. Satan had so incited the people against Moses and Eleazar that they wanted to stone them. Moses hereupon prayed to God, saying, "Deliver me and Eleazar from this unmerited suspicion, and show also to the people Aaron's bier, that they may not believe him to be still alive, for in their boundless admiration for Aaron, they may even make a god of him." This again relates to the golden calf, the fact that the Israelites did not want to worship Yahweh, did not want to obey the law given to Moses on Sinai, rejected all of that in favor of benevolent, loving, joyful gods. They did not want to embrace Moses' religion, which was the religion of Akhenaten. They had several ancient Canaanite gods, a whole pantheon of gods, and they continued to worship those gods through to today. The Kabbalists are polytheists who worship Shekhinah, who was the Canaanite goddess Asherah, and they worship El, his son Baal, and the full pantheon of gods, whom they make the 70 princes of the Gentile nations. Ginsburg also wrote, pricked on by speeches such as these, Korah's horde, Korah is the man I've been referring to, who is said to be the reincarnated soul of Cain in several of the ancient sages' writings. And if he's Cain, perhaps he murdered Moses as a retelling of the story of Cain and Abel. And this was to get the superior God of human sacrifices. Yahweh was a God of human sacrifice. He asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, but then he substituted a ram in Isaac's place. The Canaanites used to sacrifice their firstborn to the god Moloch, and they wanted to reject Moses' laws, and they probably continued to engage in sacrifice of their firstborn in the temple all the way through to the destruction of the second temple, as I've demonstrated in some of my books, which you can find at my website, CJBBooks.com. I suggest you pick those up and read them. You'll find them intensely interesting and informative. Pricked on by speeches such as these, Korah's horde appeared before Moses and Aaron, saying, heavier is the burden that ye lay upon us than was that of the Egyptians. And moreover, as since the incident of the spies, we are forced annually to offer as a tribute to death 15,000 men, it would have been better for us had we stayed in Egypt. They also reproached Moses and Aaron with unjustified love of power, saying, upon Sinai, Israel heard the words of the Lord, I am thy Lord. Wherefore then lift ye up yourselves above the congregation of the Lord. Korah and 200 some odd of his followers rejected Moses and Aaron. They pointed out that Moses was a mass murderer, as is clear from the stories in Genesis, Exodus, and Deuteronomy. Moses slew many, many, many Israelites. He was a mass murderer. His God was a genocidal God. They rejected it. Korah pointed out that Aaron and the priesthood were exploiting the people, taking their food, forcing them to starve, that this was all a very extremely exploitive religion that was terribly harmful to the Israelites, that they had it better off in Egypt under the Pharaoh, and that they were foolish to follow Moses, and that they should get rid of the laws of Moses and stop treating Aaron as their overlord and as their priest, and abandon all of that religion and take up something far more sensible, which was beneficial to the common people, instead of benefiting Moses and Aaron. They knew no bounds in their attacks upon Moses. They accused him of leading an immoral life and even warned their wives to keep far from him. They did not, moreover, stop short at words, but tried to stone Moses, when at last he sought protection from God and called to him for assistance. And this is one of the reasons I think Korah should be a prime suspect in the murder of Moses, because again, it fits in perfectly with the typology of Cain and Abel. He said, I do not care if they insult me or Aaron, but I insist that the insult of the Torah be avenged. If these men die the common death of all men, I shall myself become a disbeliever and declare the Torah was not given by God. And that's straight out of the Old Testament. So again, I have several novel theories as to who it is that the occult and knowledgeable Kabbalists and Judaists and Christians and Muslims believe actually murdered Moses. And I've included in this also the theories of Goethe, Sellin, and Freud. First of all, God might have killed Moses, or Moses might have martyred himself for the sake of the Israelite peoples who he brought into peril through his own sins. When they had worshipped the golden calf which Aaron cast out of the Egyptians' jewelry, Moses said, "But now please forgive their sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." So Moses was offering himself up as a martyr for his people. So the mythology may be that Moses either committed suicide or was killed by Yahweh. Numbers chapter 20, verse 12 states, "But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them." So Yahweh was extremely angry with Moses and Aaron because Yahweh had told Moses to speak to a rock and cause it to bring forth water, as he had previously done by striking a rock with his rod. And this was done because the Israelites were complaining that they were better off in Egypt, that they did not want Yahweh, and that they were dying of thirst and did not have the nourishment that they needed, and that Moses had led them into disaster, and that the God of Moses was a horrific God who wanted to exterminate the Israelites. And Moses sinned against God by, instead of speaking to the rock, he once again struck it with the rod as he had been commanded to do before. And Yahweh saw that as a terrible act of disobedience and remained angry with Moses and Aaron. So the question is, did God in fact kill Moses, or did Moses feel obliged to kill himself to appease Yahweh for the sake of the Israelites? As I said, two of the other prime suspects are Miriam and Aaron, who conspired against Moses because he had married a Cushite, which implies that his father-in-law Jethro was also problematic because he was a high priest of the Medians of northwest Arabia. Numbers chapter 12, verses 1 to 2 states, "Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. 'Has the Lord spoken only through Moses?' they asked. 'Hasn't he also spoken through us?' And the Lord heard this." All three brothers and sisters, Miriam, Aaron, and Moses, were prophets, and the Lord spoke through them. But it was only Moses who was able to speak to God face to face. And God, the God, Yahweh, called that to Miriam and Aaron's attention and pointed out why Moses was so special to Yahweh. So I think this may be a cryptic allusion to the fact that Miriam and Aaron may have been involved in the murder of Moses. Another possibility is that the Israelites in general got together and murdered Moses, or got together under the direction of Korah or Joshua, who was of the tribe of Ephraim, and Caleb, who was of the tribe of Judah, might have murdered Moses. Hosea chapter 12, verses 13 through 14, which I guess in Luther's Bible is Hosea chapter 12, verse 15. And that is what chiefly inspired Ernst Sellin to believe that the Israelites had gotten together and murdered Moses because they rejected his tyranny, they rejected the Torah, they rejected Yahweh because the Torah and the Yahweh are genocidal, exterminationist, rapist, mass murdering, horrific books and religion. The Lord used a prophet to bring Israel up from Egypt. By a prophet he cared for him, but Ephraim has aroused his bitter anger. His Lord will leave him on the guilt of his bloodshed and will repay him for his contempt. And Sellin saw this as a clear indication that Hosea and the later prophets were cryptically informing the world that Ephraim, perhaps Joshua, Ephraim is not the son of Joseph in the book of Hosea. It can either represent the northern tribes or the Israelites as a whole, and may be a cryptic allusion to Joshua. And Moses put his hands on Joshua, and Joshua received the spirit of wisdom of Yahweh. So the transition of power from Moses to Joshua is made clear in Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 9, and it may well be that Joshua slew Moses, and that was how the transition of power took place, as Goethe had indicated. Numbers chapter 16, verses 1 to 3, 41, chapter 20, verses 2 to 5. Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, and certain Reubenites, Dathan and Abiram, sons of Eliab, and On, son of Peleth, became insolent and rose up against Moses. Again, this is the Korah who in the Midrash, the Talmud, and other writings of the Chazar is equated to Cain and is said to bear the soul of Cain. With them were 250 Israelite men, well-known community leaders who had been appointed members of the council. They came as a group to oppose Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You have gone too far. The whole community is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is with them. Why then do you set yourselves above the Lord's assembly?" The next day, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses. "You have killed the Lord's people," they said. And again, the Chazal go to great lengths discussing Korah and his historical significance, and how he rejected the tyranny of Moses and Aaron, and how he pointed out that their laws enabled them to exploit the Israelite people, and that the Israelite people would be infinitely better off without Moses and the Torah and Yahweh. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink." So there you have it. There is my list of likely suspects. And I'm digging deeply into this to see if the sages can clue me in as to who it really was that they believed killed Moses. And I think some of the answers lie in Deuteronomy chapter 21, where it talks about the broken neck calf and the rituals of the priest and the stranger that was killed in the wilderness. And in one of my books, I point out that that was most likely Cain, and they had to hide that murder because the murder of Cain is punished manyfold in every generation. The punishment gets worse and worse, so they're very careful to cover that up. But In Lurianic Kabbalah, Moses is said to bear the soul of Cain. So there's probably a connection there also to Moses and the idea that the priests had gotten together and killed Moses. And I'm going to put all that together in the 3rd volume of my Satanic Secrets of Jesus Christ series. The first 2 volumes have been published, and you can find them at my website, cjbbooks.com. There will be a link to that in the description below. I humbly ask that you please donate. There is a PayPal donation link in the description below as well. I thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe. Again, I'm going to be talking about the Egyptian roots of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam with Sami Abu Saleh in a couple of days. If you subscribe, you'll get notified about that. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.